All right, hey guys, welcome back. It's Gene. Wanted to do another video here about de-icing procedures this time in the PC-12. I know that this is something that a lot of you guys probably haven't seen or had the chance to encounter out there, but it is something that occasionally comes up in professional flying, so I wanted to show you how it works. So this was a flight that I did. I'm just going to let the video play actually because it's going to be a little bit before we get to the actual de-icing part of the video, but a couple years ago at an airport in the Midwest in the wintertime, and flew the passengers out in the morning, had a nice sit at the FBO, and it snowed during the daytime. The airplane got covered in snow, and then it was time to fly them back at night, and had to de-ice the airplane. You can see actually some of that snow is still right there on the window. But yeah, we want to always use what's known in commercial aviation as the clean aircraft concept, which means we don't want to take off with any snow or ice or frost adhering to the airplane anywhere. The flying surfaces or any other surface of the airplane for that matter. So the aircraft has to be completely clean of any of that stuff before we take off. And the reason for that is because if you have snow or ice on the airplane, it does a bunch of bad stuff to the aerodynamics that you don't want. It destroys lift, it increases drag, it adds a little bit of weight, and it just generally makes the airplane not want to fly. So it can change the stalling speed, it changes the way the airplane handles, all kinds of bad stuff. So we got to get that stuff off the airplane before we fly. Now the preferred way of de-icing an airplane, if you can, if there's not too much ice on the airplane and you're not in too much of a hurry, is to just put the airplane in a heated hangar. But that unfortunately was not an option on this day because they didn't have any space in the hangar. So had to do the de-icing procedure here, and it's very expensive to have to do this, so it's something we try to avoid if at all possible, and get in the hangar if we see any snow or ice or anything like that coming, freezing rain or anything. But sometimes you can't always do that, and this was one of those occasions. So anyway, this was at an airport that is a fairly decent sized airport. It's got airline service, and so they have de-icing available. Of course, not every FBO or airport is going to have de-icing available, but this one did. And what you want to do, if you know you have to de-ice, is coordinate with the FBO beforehand. And before you get in the airplane, you're going to let them know, like, hey, I need to de-ice. Where do you want me to taxi? There's typically a designated space on the ramp because it makes a big mess when they spray your airplane with the de-icing fluid, and they don't want to do it right up front there. So usually they'll have kind of a designated spot on the edge of the ramp or a dedicated de-icing pad that they're going to have you taxi to before they spray the airplane. So you coordinate that with them beforehand, and this airport, like I said, does have airline service, so they have an actual dedicated de-icing pad over on the other side of the tower over here that you'll see we'll taxi to in a second. But so yeah, the first thing you do is coordinate where you're going to go, and then the professional thing to do, and what I always tried to do, especially if it was my first time working with a particular de-icing crew at an airport, at a particular FBO that is kind of give the guys that are going to be doing the de-icing a little bit of a briefing on what I want them to do. So, you know, different airplanes are going to have kind of slight variations of how the de-icing procedures work. And, you know, certain spots of the airplane that you want them to spray, and certain, more importantly, certain spots of the airplane that you actually don't want them to spray, that you want them to avoid. They know to spray the wings and the tail and that stuff, obviously, that's the most important part, but in some cases there are going to be surfaces that you want them to avoid. So, and there's a list of things on the PC-12, list of areas that are pretty common to most airplanes that you don't want de-icing fluid to get on. The probes, the gear, you don't want that stuff on the brakes. You don't want them to spray the windows directly, nothing forward of the door, on the nose. And I'm going to pause it for just a second, but so you can see the snow on the ground here. I'm just taxiing over to the de-ice pad. The reason we don't want them to spray the nose is because the air intake is up there, and if you get de-icing fluid into the bleed air system, it's going to come into the cabin, and it's really poisonous, so you don't want to have those fumes in the cabin, so you don't want them to spray anywhere up there. Plus, the windshield is heated, so, you know, usually what you can do is just kind of, I think on this day, I think I kind of was able to take a broom or a brush, and it's been a couple years ago, so I don't remember exactly, but I can tell based on how well I had this cleaned off, except for that little spot on the window, that I was able to just kind of brush off the snow that was on the windshield and on like the cowling and the nose up there and stuff. Maybe there was a little bit on the prop, wasn't really adhering to the airplane, but you don't want to ever assume that it's going to blow off on the takeoff run and not de-ice, because it might not. There's no guarantee of that, so you just always assume that it's going to stay put. But anyway, you don't want to get any de-icing fluid up there on the nose. Of course, on a turbofan or a jet, you don't want any de-icing fluid around the engines for the same reason. You don't want that stuff getting ingested into the engines. So anyway, so I do a little briefing with them first and kind of let them know what was up with that. You can coordinate if there's a particular frequency they want you on for communications during the de-icing. Sometimes they don't have that capability, so you would just use hand signals, which is pretty common at some of the smaller FBOs. On this particular night, the FBO did have an Iceman frequency, and I could actually get them on the radio. This was kind of like full service de-icing, like airline style de-icing. They have a full truck with the crane and the bucket that the guy sits in. You'll see it in a minute. You can get them on the radio. There's a de-ice pad, all that stuff. They had Type 1 and Type 4 fluid. Everything that they use on the airlines was available to us because they had airline service at this airport. So anyway, you can see the truck out there. That's the de-icing truck. That's your Iceman, and he's just waiting for me to shut the engine down. And I'm talking on the radio to him there, just letting him know what I'm doing. Just making sure I'm in the spot that they want me. And now I'm going to go ahead and shut the airplane down. So we have to de-ice with the engine shut down so that we don't have all that prop wash blowing everything away, all the de-icing fluid, and just causing a hazard to those guys while they're operating on the airplane and stuff. So engine's got to get shut down. I'm going to leave the battery on. It only takes, a matter of minutes for them to do this. So you can run the battery so you can still have radio communication with the guys. But I'm turning pretty much everything else off to preserve battery juice, since the PC-12 obviously does not have an APU, unfortunately. So yeah, just getting it shut down. And they'll pull up, and they've got to tell you several things. And I'm actually going to pause it for a second to give you a little bit of information on how the actual, it's called a two-step de-icing process works. So the fluid is, the first stage is Type 1 fluid, which is dyed an orange color so you can identify it, and it's an ethylene glycol solution. And it's applied hot, and it's there to just take the ice off. So it'll just melt the snow or the ice, whatever's on the airplane, but it has very limited anti-icing properties. So it's good at de-icing, but it's not great at anti-icing, which means if you have active ground icing conditions, which means it's snowing or it's sleeting or you got freezing rain at the airport or something that's still actively falling, you're going to not only have to de-ice the airplane to clear off anything that's already on the airplane, but you're going to also have to get anti-icing fluid, which is Type 4 fluid applied, which is a green color, to prevent further ice from forming on the airplane between the de-icing procedure and takeoff. So as you taxi out, you don't want to be collecting ice on the airplane, and then by the time you get to the runway, you're iced up and you couldn't take off. So that's what the Type 4 fluid is for. That's anti-icing fluid. So on this night, luckily we didn't have any active ground icing conditions. The snow had already fallen and the storm moved on, so it was just, it was still cloudy, but there was no snow falling. Oh, you know what? Actually, I don't think that's true. I think there was just a little bit of snow falling, and we'll see on the video. I haven't watched this through all the way yet. It's been a while, but I think I did have the two-step on this particular one, and because there was just enough snow in the area that I was a little concerned about picking up some ice on the way to the runway. But in any event, so they'll apply the Type 1 fluid to de-ice the airplane, and they go all around the airplane. If you can imagine, and again, except for the nose, like I just said, but if you can imagine a walk-around inspection, you're going to start on the wing root leading edge of one of the wings, and then work your way around to the, all the way to the wingtip, and then the other side of the wing, the trailing edge, and then the fuselage and the empennage, the tail, and around to the other wing. That's kind of the pattern that they follow. They'll just kind of drive the truck around and spray all the surfaces that they can, and get all that ice off. And then after they're done with that, they'll come back around and do the same thing with the Type 4 fluid, which is the green stuff, which is a little more viscous. It's a little bit more jelly. It's kind of thick, so it doesn't run off as easily. The Type 1 fluid runs off pretty quickly. The Type 4 is designed to stay on the airplane and kind of, it gels up a little bit so that it can cling onto the airplane enough to where it doesn't shear off the airplane until you're rotating or in the air. So it's built for faster rotation speeds, and it's rated for a particular speed. For the PC-12, we rotated about 80 knots. It's more than enough for us, but it'll work even on most airline jets. And the Type 4 is actually applied cold. So I'll just let this play can see the prop spinning down, and they're going to drive the truck up. I've probably let them know at this point on the radio that I'm ready for them to go ahead and advance. That's probably what I just did right there. Like, hey, the prop stopped, you can come on up. And so what they have to do is they'll come up and they're going to let you know exactly what types of fluid they're applying to the airplane, and then whatever dilution. So the type 4 fluid is often diluted with water, and they'll give you the dilution, you know, whether it's like 50-50 mix or whatever the ratio is, depending on what they use. And then you've got to look up in a table, which is called the FAA HOT table, which is HOT stands for holdover times. And it's a table that the FAA publishes. They update it every so often, and it has all of the different fluid types, like the manufacturer names of the fluid types that are listed on this table, and you can look up exactly what type of fluid they're using, or if they don't tell you, you can ask, or if they don't know or whatever, you can just use the generic. And then you'll look up on this table specifically what your holdover time is. And holdover time means, and you can see the crane moving around out here a little bit, so they're getting ready to cut. There they go. I think they're starting to move up to the airplane now. Holdover time means that the Type 4 anti-ice fluid has a particular amount of time that it's designed to be effective from the time that it's applied to the time that, you know, you can't trust it to do its job anymore. And it's pretty long, you know, it can be 15 or 20 or even, you know, it can be up to like 30 or 40 minutes, or I think maybe even longer than that if you have like very, very light icing conditions, and the table will break down exactly what the time is. It's going to ask for the, so they're starting to spray with type 1. So you can see one guy drives the truck, the other guy's in the bucket, just spraying the hose, and they'll just kind of work their way around the airplane, taking all the ice off. But anyway, so back to that holdover time table, that'll give you the specifics of your holdover time given the temperature and the type of ground icing condition that you have occurring at the airport, whether it's, you know, heavy snow or moderate snow, light freezing rain, freezing, I think freezing fog is on there, like all the different types of stuff that can happen. And so you just match up the right conditions for the temperature, and then it'll give you your holdover time. Holdover times for Part 91 are not absolute requirements. They're not controlling, meaning if you exceed the holdover time, you can still take off. It's legal to do so, but you know, not necessarily prudent. So you always want to do what's known as a pre-takeoff contamination check on a representative surface of the airplane. So that means, and usually the manufacturer will tell you what the representative surfaces are on the airplane. So it might be, you know, the leading edges of the wing if the cockpit is close enough to the leading edges in that airplane that you can look out and see those effectively. It might be an outside air temperature probe. It might be a part of the windshield. It might be a part of the engine cowling. Anything that you can usually see from the cockpit. On the bigger airplanes, in some cases, you'll actually have to send a pilot back out of the cockpit, and they'll walk back from the flight deck and look out a passenger window. Like, this is what they kind of used to do on some of the airliners, and they'd send the flight engineer back, and he would lean over and look out of the you know, one of the passenger windows at the wings and make sure that the wings weren't picking up any ice. So but what you're looking for on that pre-takeoff contamination check is you want to see gloss. That type 4 fluid should look really nice and glossy, and that means that you don't have ice in there. If it's kind of opaque, if it gets a little milky looking and it's gelling up a little bit, that means that it's not, it's saturated, right? So it's not doing its job anymore, and you would not want to take off if it had that appearance. You'd have to taxi back and do it all over again and double your bill, and your boss probably wouldn't be too happy about that. But it's incredibly rare to have that happen with type 4 fluid because it has such a long holdover time. So anyway, not usually an issue, but so yeah, just waiting for them to do their thing, and after this, they're gonna start hitting me with type 4, and they'll give you at the end over the radio, again, the specific fluid that they used, and also the time that they started to apply the fluid. And that's important because you want to start the holdover time clock, if you will, from the time that they started applying the type 4 fluid, not the time they finished, but the time that they started, because that's going to be the oldest fluid on the airplane, right? So yeah, so that's the gist of it. Then a couple considerations when you're taxiing. Again, each airplane is different. You can find this stuff always in the AFM. Manufacturer will tell you what to do. In the PC-12, we taxi with the flaps up until we're basically at the runway, and we do that so that the Type 4 fluid doesn't run down the flaps. And we want that surface to be kind of nice and level, right? So if you extend the flaps, you're going to get some run back on those flaps, and you want that fluid to stay on the wing. So flaps up, and then you keep the ECS off so that you're not drawing in bleed air. Again, shouldn't be a problem. You can see though, like there's some of this Type 1 has kind of come up onto the nose a little bit because it happens. It's a kind of a mist when you can see some of that up there. So you're going to get a little bit around the air intake. So it's good to run the engine for a little bit, kind of let the prop wash and you know the heat from the lip try to get that fluid out of there before you actually open up the bleed and start to pump in that air into the cabin with the ECS. So ECS off until you're at the runway. So you got to remember, you know, you won't be in the habit of doing it because normally when you taxi, you've already got the flap set and the ECS is already in auto, like right after you start the engine up, or you know. So, but in this case, you have to remember to hit those as you're taking the runway for departure. Yeah, and I don't think there's really anything else other than that. You do have to be a little bit prepared on the takeoff run with Type 4 on the airplane that it's going to feel a little bit sluggish when you rotate because you've got all that gel on the airplane, and it's nothing dangerous. It's to be expected. The manufacturer tells you to expect that. The airplane flies just fine, but it does feel like slightly sluggish. It's not. It's almost imperceptible, and it depends on, like, you know, how much fluid's on the airplane and all that stuff. But that can be something that you notice a little bit. After you lift off and you're in the climb, the slipstream is going to carry away the anti-ice fluid over time. It's just going to shear off the airplane. When you land, the airplane is going to be pretty much dry, like nothing happened. You will find puddles of green Type 4 de-ice fluid on the hangar floor the next day because in aerodynamically quiet areas of the airplane, that stuff doesn't really get sheared off. So you'll find it in like weird spots, like up in some of the recesses where the flaps, you know, and the flap rails, and I'm trying to remember, maybe a little bit like in the gear wells, or just like little nooks and crannies. You'll find that fluid just drains out over the next day or two, and you get like puddles on the floor the next morning. But let's see. All right, so they're done. They're pulling away, and I'm going to fire up. So we've coordinated on the radio that they're done. They gave me the time that they started to apply the Type 4. Of course, I can look out the window and follow along with what they're doing, but they're going to assume that I'm not watching exactly and give me that time. And yeah, I'm just going to start up, call for my taxi instructions, taxi out, and go. And yeah, the idea is if you take off in active ground icing conditions, which then become icing conditions in flight, presumably, the aircraft's ice control systems will take over in flight. So we have the boots and we have the prop heat, we have the windshield heat and all that stuff, you know, the probe heat, of course. All that stuff will take care of us when we're in flight, but we can't really run that stuff on the ground. I mean, we can run some of it on the ground, but it's not going to clear ice off, you know, off of all the other surfaces of the airplanes that we still have to go ahead and get the de-icing procedure done. So, but yeah, just firing up here, going through kind of the normal after start flow, running the checklist, and I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. Let's see, I'm just getting the heat turned on, I guess I'm testing the autopilot there, turning on my panel lights, all that good stuff. So I'll fast forward a little bit. And now we're taxiing away from the de-ice pad. There's plenty of snow on the taxiway, so I'm taxiing a little bit slower than actually a lot slower than I normally would. And let's see, I think we're coming up on the runway here, maybe? I'm not sure where we are. Nope, we're just taxiing still. There we go. Got the strobes on, which means we're taking the runway. And I think it was kind of a low overcast this night, a little bit of snow still falling. And so we're going to be pretty much into the soup right away here, into the clouds. And we did pick up a little ice in the climb. I do remember, I think we got on top by like maybe 8,000 or 9,000. And it was, you know, pretty night up on top of the clouds, but did pick up a little bit of, I think, rime ice in the clouds there, which isn't too uncommon if you got a little bit of snow around. Usually you'll find that clouds that are producing a lot of snow, like if it's very like dry snow, they don't produce a lot of ice, which is nice. It's the, you know, the droplets in the clouds are pretty much already all frozen. Remember that it's the super cold droplets that'll stick to the airplane. If it's already frozen like snow, it just bounces right off the airplane. It won't stick to you. It's not a problem at all. No big deal. But you can see on the next rad there are some snow bands in the area. So yeah, after we lift off, you'll notice that I did not retract the gear. And I'm going to leave that extended for another just few seconds here, and the reason for that is because anytime there's snow and slush on the ground, like on the taxiways and the runway, and you pick up that stuff with the gear, after you lift off, you want to climb with the gear hanging out into the wind, extend it a little bit to let that dry off and blow off. That way the gear doesn't freeze up in the wells. So there you go, I just retracted it, but you just want to try to get that cleaned off before you retract the gear on those departures. So yeah, other than that, uneventful flight home. So anyway, hope that helps give you guys an idea of how that works. Let me know if you have any questions, and or if you want to discuss any other systems on the PC-12. I'm always looking for video ideas, different things I can walk you guys through. So let me know in the comments. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you on the next one.